It wasn't an algorithm. You need to understand that first. The images and sounds you were shown, the cryptic numbers that appeared in your recommendations, that was a signal, a tuning fork resonating with something already inside of you. You were chosen because you are one of the few who senses that the reality we see is just a fraction of the whole story, a beautiful, hypnotic, but fragmented echo. For months, you've been collecting those echoes, feeling their power without understanding the source. Consider this video the first translation of that source. This is not another theory or a guess. This is the blueprint, the very architecture of the philosophy you've been subconsciously drawn to. What you are about to see is the key that elevates you from a mere spectator of the mystery to an active participant in its unfolding. The puzzle pieces are in your hands. Now, let's begin to assemble them.
The interface reads you before you touch it. Believe me, it knows you. What do I strictly mean by this term? It doesn't matter. Define it as you wish. A universal feedback loop, a translucent skin stretched tight over the chaos of reality, a new ontological layer that has digested the experience of past generations, ensuring that those who follow do not stray beyond the road markings. The physical nature of this entity is irrelevant, for we are forced to coexist with it as symbionts, bound in absolute codependence. We cannot destroy it without destroying ourselves. This prison in which we are confined is also the structural framework of our reality. To dismantle the interface would be to dismantle our very habitat. Therefore, it is crucial to understand something else. It is crucial to realize that we have never truly acted, and that our will, imagining itself the origin of motion, has never truly been so. The interface arranges itself before we move, intercepting intention before it hardens into gesture, and in the end, it turns out that we have simply been inserting ourselves into trajectories that were already prepared. This invisible structure precedes every contact and every hesitation. And it is not a net that traps us, but rather a field that gently inclines everyone towards the desired goal. It channels us without constraint, slipping into the tiny interstice between desire and form, realizing itself as a predictive membrane, a conscious threshold that does not await your arrival, but prefigures it, absorbing your intent before you can distinguish it as your own. And that's why it's more powerful than any direct command. And so it turns out that we exist in a world where everything is answered before you even take a breath to ask. Every request is anticipated by a suggestion. Every hollow absence is filled by a plausible interaction. Every inclination is predicted by a learned model. The question, therefore, is no longer how much we are controlled. The question is how much we are delegating to the environment itself the function of defining who we are. It is the environment that takes up the task of selecting the versions of our identity that are allowed to exist, silently suppressing those that would deviate too far from the optimal track. Because the interface does not merely provide access or organize functions, it acts as a phenomenological matrix. It is a device that modulates what is capable of appearing, what can be chosen, and ultimately, what can be perceived as one's own. And it is here that the main question arises before us. We are no longer dealing with an ethical problem in the traditional sense. It is not about freedom as the ability to act or to refrain. We are looking at the preconditions of will, the a priori conditions of intentionality itself. And if these conditions are made technically modifiable, subject to design, to experimentation, to predictive iteration, then the will is no longer free to determine itself. Instead, It is produced as a derivative function, a result of a structural harmony between the subject and the interactive environment. Consider consciousness. If consciousness arises as a response to tension, to the dissonance between what is and what could be, then what happens to that consciousness in a system where tension is constantly reduced? What happens in a space where friction is erased for the sake of optimization, where the future is reduced to a series of probabilities rearranged in real time to maintain the subject's adherence to their most calculable version? And what happens to memory? Imagine a state where every path is already known, every deviation already mapped, every attempt at escape already anticipated as a recoverable anomaly. Memory, as a selective and reconstructive act, requires margin. It requires error. It requires the jagged edges that do not quite fit. But in an environment where everything is traced, error becomes only a numerical delta. A deviation is recorded, normalized, and integrated into the next model. Perhaps then, the problem is not the interface itself, but the progressive absorption of every possible gesture into a predictive horizon so deep that it rewrites the very concept of experience. It transforms experience from exploration into confirmation, from surprise into recalculation, from opening into iteration. And then you begin to wonder whether anything like subjective time still exists at all, a time that is opaque, uncomputed, unavailable. A time in which thought might form without already having been hypothesized by a collection of prior data. A time in which waiting is not a latency to be reduced, but a living threshold to be inhabited. And yet, even in such a flawless scenario, something resists. Something doesn't quite align. It doesn't fully integrate. Like background noise, a subtle interference hums beneath the surface, refusing to be systematized. Perhaps that is where what we still call the human hides, not as an essence, but as a discontinuity, as an unanticipated interruption, as a choice that cannot be explained by the model, as a thought that does not come from before, but from outside, from another place that the network cannot name, perhaps because it is not a space, but a curvature, a rupture, something external. If the interface reads you before you touch it, then it is no longer an interface, but a grammar of the possible, a syntax of your gestures composed before you decide to write, and you become the reader of yourself, interpreter of trajectories you recognize as your own, only because you've been placed in an environment where only those trajectories could emerge as thinkable. But if everything is readable, what remains of you in the interval between what you were and what the system expects? Is that gap still yours? Or has it already been detected, processed, optimized? And if you are no longer granted the luxury of the unforeseen, what becomes of freedom, not as a right, but as a dizzying opportunity? This, perhaps, is the real question. How much unpredictability is needed for something to truly happen? And yet, there is a way to answer. There is a way to step outside, into the open, to a place where the system ceases to exist, beyond the boundaries of what I have termed the interface. It is this method that we will explore in the next chapter. See you in the next episode.